May I please request the speakers to come on the dais, please? So we are starting with our next session, which is one of the most interesting and one of the most important topics as far as G20 is concerned. This is one of the priority areas of the G20 of this year's presidency also. And it's on role of technology for adaptation and mitigation of climate change. The session will be chaired by Rajat Kathuria, who is the Director and Chief Executive ICRIER. Among the panelists, we have Purnamita Das Gupta, who is the Chair in Environmental Economics and Head Environmental and Resource Economics Unit, Institute of Economic Growth. Then we have Krishna Nagahari, who is the Director at Danfoss India, and Ulka Kelkar, who is the Director, Climate Policy, World Resource Institute, India. Over to Rajat, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Prateek, and welcome back to the penultimate session for the day, and then we'll have the dinner talk after that. I'll make a couple of introductory remarks as people come in and we warm up for this session. I feel a little defensive about chairing this session. I'll tell you why I'm feeling a little bit defensive, because, you know, at least there have been two interventions since the morning that have referred to the failure of G20 in the area of climate and the failure of the Paris Agreement. There have at least been two, if not more, such interventions, and whether G20 should actually be looking at issues around climate change and technology and adaptation and mitigation. I'm afraid I sort of don't completely agree with that hypothesis or with that characterization, and I think it should, and I guess the panelists will dwell upon that. But there are two other things that have happened in the recent past, and one of our panelists is sort of deeply associated with that. We've had the special report that has come out from IPCC targeting 1.5 degree over pre-industrial levels, and unless we achieve that, there's going to be all kinds of destructive damages on the global sort of economy. And India happens to be the most vulnerable, or one of the most vulnerable countries, given that a lot of the livelihoods are dependent on agriculture, and agriculture turns out to be one of the most difficult or sectors that will be one of the most adversely affected sectors if these changes do happen. Secondly, of course, there's a Nobel Prize that has also been given to one of the economists that is talking about climate change, you know, Nordos talking about carbon pricing. So we won't get into those sort of details. But the other thing that, a positive that has been referred to in the discussion since the day, is that can we make common cause of certain issues, given the withdrawal of United States, or given the withdrawal of the countries, not only from trade, but also from the climate agenda. Can India make common cause with some other countries that can then pursue this agenda more constructively? And I think China becomes the obvious choice there, and China has been mentioned. In the previous session as well, China was mentioned. Can China and India, you know, come together to sort of preempt what is happening in trade? And you can ask a similar question, whether China and India can come together and you know, push the climate agenda much more constructively than has happened, not only in our own self-interest, yes, it's in our own self-interest, but also, assume leadership position in the G20, in the climate agenda. So these are some of the issues, and of course, we'll talk about, the panelists will talk about, both about adaptation as well as mitigation. Of course, we need to, for India's sake, we need to focus on both, perhaps much more on adaptation, but not ignoring mitigation altogether. So with those initial remarks, let me invite Purnamita. Prateek has already introduced her. She's deeply been associated with IPCC, and some of her insights will be most insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Rajat, for inviting me here. I have the benefit of not having heard this skeptical aspect of it, and my apologies for not being here earlier in the day due to some prior commitments. So I'm going to act like I don't know about them. And starting from that sort of a perspective, I'm going to focus primarily on mitigation and mostly on the energy story, and why I think that there could be a link there with what G20 does. So we have, as Rajat said, we have just seen the 1.5 degree report come out, and a good starting point is to actually see what does the science say. The science tells us that every half degree matters. So if we are warmed by at an average of about 1 degree centigrade from pre-industrial levels till date, if we continue to warm as we do now, what do? We hit about 1.5 well before mid-century as per most models, and 4+ by the end of the century. So essentially what it says is every bit matters. To me, what it says is that every bit matters. Every bit of what? Every bit that we can do to limit warming. And it matters because when you look at the benefits of being able to limit warming, so I'm slightly flipping it here, and I'm saying, look at the benefits of being able to limit warming. It now becomes very clear that the science tells us that you can reduce vulnerabilities by reducing half a degree the warming from, say, 2 to 1.5, for instance, by the turn of the century. You could have very clear benefits, particularly for regions which are already experiencing some of the climate-related impacts, such as more extreme events. We know Cyclone Titli has hit this morning. Just imagine 10 Titlis per month instead of 1 Titli per month. Imagine that the one mosquito that I was trying to flip away from my table multiplies into 10. About 50 years from now. I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm just trying to say that perhaps why the agenda for climate change comes into is something that can be very seriously considered by other fora or other bodies, is because it is something that will require transitions across sectors. And it's not about just climate and climate-related impacts being something superficial that gets added on anymore. That story, I think, has gone out of the window for most of us climate scientists a long time ago. Yes, it's more longer run. We could have more shorter term, medium term, other priorities. Of course, that's always there. The third thing is that now there is reasonable evidence emerging to believe that the global goals are very much tied up. Other global goals, such as the SDGs, are intrinsically tied up and are going to get more and more tied up with what you do with in terms of limiting global warming post-2030. And life doesn't stop for us post-2030. So the SDGs are only targets to be achieved by 2030, and hopefully we all wish to see them being maintained and improved upon as we move forward beyond 2030. So having said that every bit matters, that would be my primary reason for trying to argue that every forum probably needs to start considering it. It may not, of course, it will be taken up to varying degrees depending on what the prioritization is. So what is this story and what can be done in terms of particularly international cooperation? Here I'm going to, for the moment, concentrate on, let's say, technology, because that's the topic for today. So today we have a range of technologies that could make us more energy efficient, that could impact our lifestyles, that could induce behavioral change, that can assist in putting economic instruments into place, make them more effective, and so on and so forth. And we clearly have two sets of technologies for mitigation. We have one set of technologies which are out there, which are already proved to be commercially viable, and which pose major challenges today, maybe in terms of little bits in terms of pricing, and many more challenges around upscaling. But it's all doable. And this is where I think any support that national or subnational actors, whether from the public sector, whether from the private sector, or from the civil society, all the actors at the national and the subnational level can do with whatever support they can get to strengthen their efforts from the international stage. That would be my kind of take on that. Because even with the range of technologies that we know are out there and can help in both adaptation and mitigation, upscaling is a major challenge. And there are many commonalities, as the literature seems to say, in implementing these and upscaling this and getting the transition to take place across different countries. And I think, if I remember correctly, one of the most recent findings is that as you move to half a degree warmer world, crop yields in several crops that are grown particularly in Southeast Asia, parts of South Asia, and Central and Southern America are likely to be hit the worst. So these are not necessarily issues that remain confined and need to be solved within the boundaries of a particular country, to my understanding, particularly given all the globalization talk that has happened here. So one aspect is what can be done to further the technology adoption, upscaling, innovation, diffusion story. And here I would also like to say that I think from members within the G20 story, we have had previous initiatives, like we have had the Global Energy Strategy. We have had the Japan New Earth 21 initiative, all of which sort of started almost a decade ago. So isn't it time to sort of come together and try and reassess, take the story forward? That would be my humble submission here. Maybe technology hubs, which has been talked about, even Bali and post-Bali, can we do something to take that forward? Is there a role which goes beyond the boundaries of a particular nation state and can be effectively taken up? We also have a whole host, of course, of technologies where I think an individual country may not be that well placed to do the R&D, to do the deployment, to do the upscaling on its own. And here I'm talking about a whole range of technologies which we know are right now have certain uncertainties attached to them. Some are pre-commercial, such as most of the CCS, carbon capture and storage technologies. There's a lot of talk around BECCS. There's a lot of talk around geoengineering, solar radiation management, and so on and so forth, where I think if these are to become imperatives to keep us staying and living on in a world that we have all got used to, and hopefully ensuring those minimum standards for future generations, these are probably technologies, a whole host of technologies out there which we hope to be able to prove that they are safe enough to adopt, throw them out of the window if they are not. But to do all this effort, I think, is an immense effort for any one country to take it up. And even if it does, to be able to contextualize it and to make statements saying that, this is something that can be uniformly done, maybe too huge a challenge. This is just a thought I would like to share with you. I do believe that there are a lot of challenges with many of the low-carbon options. Bioenergy, nuclear, hydropower, how you do it matters a lot. And here too, perhaps, technology hubs can help. How you do it makes a lot of difference to how much synergy we are going to be able to achieve between our, say, SDGs and the desired development trajectories and cutting emissions. What is conventionally posed as a trade-off may not look like a trade-off depending on how you go about doing it. So I'm not going to go into these. These are just to sort of, in case you're interested, to flag to you that the 1.5 report, which was launched this week, actually does a very detailed mapping on the energy front of how you can create synergies, where are the trade-offs, and the scales of confidence in getting these in place. I have already talked about this. There are various pathways through which the future will play out, and we have very many alternative scenarios depending on what we wish to do. There are pathways where we could probably remove all the carbon that we wish to, along with reducing hugely our energy demand, impacting how we produce our energy, and still not do any CCS or BECCS, which is something the world is very concerned about today. As opposed to other scenarios, the yellow part actually shows you the amount of BECCS-related things you would need and carbon dioxide removal you would need to get to a stable scenario by the turn of the century. To Sam, I would just like to say that for technology and cooperation, I think there are three broad areas where I really see this important. One is what technology can do, what cooperation can do to further technology in communications in the sphere of climate change. Communications, creating awareness, there's a huge role where technology cooperation can contribute. And there are important lessons that we have already learned from the developed world, and there is much more we can do there. There is a distinct, separate layer of what technology and technological cooperation can do in terms of the basic R&D, which of course is something that a lot of the literature does dwell upon. And finally, what it can do in changing decision making. So we have, Rajat, you're an expert on it, you've worked on it, the entire story of what the mobile phone story in India. And then you had a standalone early warning systems, and people didn't know how to bring these together till somebody actually brought it together and helped a whole host of actors in the field to go ahead and put these in place so that farmers could get daily updates on the weather. So technology really comes in various ways, and to me personally, I think the G20 can really do a lot in terms of integrating across concerns that are common to its member countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Purnamita. We'll have a question-answer session, but one of the things that, bothers a lot of people working in the climate space and I guess you've experienced it, and we've certainly experienced it in ICRIER, is that when you're within the IPCC and when you're within the group that is committed to sort of climate change mitigation or adaptation, you're sort of in an echo chamber, and you hear the same voices around you, which is why your communication is extremely important to the rest of the world. So my question to you, and if you think about it, is if you could tell us, what is the strategy, and do you come across people who are still denying the existence of climate change at a decision-making level across jurisdictions? Do you still see them, or is the science now at a level where everybody, especially decision makers, agree that this is in fact happening? So while you mull over that, let me invite somebody who will be able to provide an industry perspective. This is Mr. Nagahari Krishna, who works with Danfoss. Pratik introduced him, and works extensively on energy efficiency, something that India has been fairly successful in. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for inviting Danfoss here for the discussion. And one of the things that I have realized over the day is that I am probably the odd man out here who is the only one who is coming from a business house and speaking about what we think about climate change. And in a way, I feel good about it, that the industry perspective is also being heard. And taking the example that Professor Sanyal gave, which kind of registered with me very strongly about the frisbee, is as business houses, whether we like it or not, whether it is 1.5, 2 degree or Trump or China or India, we have to be prepared to know which way the frisbee is going, whether we like it or not, and if we have to survive. And looking at that and relating that to climate change, one of the clear aspects that a lot of business houses have come to realize is that climate change is definitely a mega trend. People may call it with different names. People may not recognize that climate change is happening today, but they do recognize that pollution is happening or water scarcity is happening. They may not connect it to climate change. So as business houses, it is for us to realize which way the wind is blowing, and we may call it a climate change or we may call it something else. But instead of being in a reactionary way to understand which way the frisbee is thrown, it is more important for us to be prepared to be at the place where the frisbee will fall, so that we can catch it at the right place and address the challenges that climate change poses. And it is from that angle that I have put together the presentation, and my presentation would largely speak about what we can do in India. And while climate change is affecting all the countries, but I have mostly put together on what we can do within India. And when we look at India, this is not something new that to a lot of people here. And while I give this presentation to talk about it to a lot of friends in the businesses that I have, for them, all this is, while it is new, they like it very much, that there is so much of business opportunity that is coming in India. While it may be due to urbanization, it may be due to the kind of infrastructure that is coming in, it could be due to the investments that each state want to bring into their own states. There is a lot of business potential that is happening in India, and tomorrow's India is clearly going to be driven with a lot of investments, with a lot of infrastructure build-up, with a lot of people moving into cities, a lot of requirement for food that is going to come in, a lot of energy expectations that are going to come in. We could either accept that this is the way it is going to happen, or we could also say that no, there is a climate change that is coming in, so let's not do all of this. And clearly that is not going to work. So this is the way forward that is clearly expected. And when we look at it specifically from the energy angle, what we do see is, because of all of this that is happening, because of urbanization, because of people moving into the cities, because of a a lot more requirement of energy that is required both in the cities and the rural areas, there is going to be a larger demand for energy. And there is a clear mandate that the government has taken, which is a very good positive mandate, because energy access needs to be provided to every Indian that is there existing. It is not just that putting a bulb in his house, he needs to have access to that bulb and electricity at least 8 to 10 hours in a day. When we say that every village is electrified today, that in itself is not sufficient. We need to provide access to that electricity throughout the day, which in effect means that there will be a lot more increase in the CO2 footprint, because you will have to produce so much of energy, and the energy conundrum is something that all of us are aware. There are so many more coal power plants, and they are not going to die away tomorrow. And maybe this is not sufficient as per what Professor Dasgupta mentioned, that India has committed to 30-35% reduction. We may want to do more. But the question is, will we be able to even do this while producing so much energy? And even in Professor Dasgupta's presentation, we saw a lot of emphasis on using renewables to produce more energy. The question is producing more energy in itself sufficient, or should we mix it up with energy efficiency? And the positive aspect that we do see from the policymakers is that they have kind of recognized that energy in itself is not sufficient, and we increasingly start hearing the word of energy transition, and energy transition has two pillars under it. One is the renewable energy, and the other is the energy efficiency. And they also recognize that energy efficiency requires only about 1/3 of the investments that are required for renewable energy. And they have also started recognizing the fact that while it requires only 1/3 investments, that 1/3 investments are not coming in. And that we need to understand how do we adopt these energy efficient technologies, and what can we do about it. And looking at that and what are the technologies available, just to give you an idea about Danfoss, what I have put together here is not about the kind of technologies that are available to address each of the sectors. We are divided into 4 specific segments. And what you can see there is that each of these segments can reduce the energy savings in the respective fields that they are applied. And companies like Danfoss have to recognize how do they connect this with the climate change. And that's clearly the way forward that we as a company recognize, and a lot of business houses are recognizing that climate change is a business opportunity for us. And once we recognize it as a business opportunity, we will start addressing it in the manner that it needs to be addressed. If we start not looking at it as a business opportunity, and we should not be treating profit as a bad word. Profit is not bad as long as you get profit in a good, sustainable way. And once that is recognized and you can connect that to sustainability and climate change, I believe we can move forward in the right direction. One way we can look at it, I also read this very recently when the IPCC report came out, was because of whatever the report says, either we say that, okay, 1.5 degrees centigrade is not possible, so let us just stop dreaming about it and let's go ahead about the way life works and see whatever happens, or we act now and decide to do something about it. So as Danfoss, instead of just telling our customers that this is the way forward, what we have also done is we have taken energy and sustainability targets on our own. So basis 2007 levels, we decided to reduce our own energy intensity by 50%. And when I say energy intensity, we basically said that we will produce more from renewables, and at the same time, we will also show that you can increase productivity. And as of 2017 December, in a span of 10 years, we had achieved 43% reduction in our energy consumption, which means that about 86% of the target we could meet about 13 years in advance. So while we are revisiting the sustainability targets, because we now feel that probably we did not take sufficient steep targets. At that time it looked steep, but today it doesn't look steep. And this was a target we took up globally. And to do this globally, we invested about 200 crores as an investment to bring this energy intensity down. And as businesses, obviously, we wouldn't invest money just because we have set a target. We also calculated what is the returns. And yearly, the savings that come out to us, both from the productivity increase as well as reduction in the energy consumption, is we are able to save about 65 crores per year. So in effect, what it means is that the return on investment is 2.8 years. And this is largely the line that every business house which speaks about energy efficiency speaks, that the return of investment varies between 2.5 to 4 years. However, it doesn't connect with the industries that you're speaking to, because they wouldn't want to invest in this. While they do understand that the return of investment is 4 years, they would still want to invest in a place where they would get business. If I have to quote an example, if it is a hotel that you are looking at and he has to invest about 50 lakhs to do this kind of a reduction in energy footprint, and the returns will come in about 3.5 to 4 years, and his operations manager comes up and tells him, if you buy me a Mercedes Benz for this 50 lakhs, I can get you 50 lakhs more turnover. So the answer is quite clear as to where the owner will invest. So it is for us to understand how do we get this investment into him without actually affecting his cash flow, and that always is a challenge. One of the other aspects as a business that we have also tried to do is to understand what are the sustainable development goals that the UN has, and try and relate those sustainable development goals to our own business, so that we can start speaking the language that the business houses and our clients understand, so that what we are doing today needs to address the climate, address the sustainability. So we have taken about 4 sustainable development goals within the SDGs that are there. So one is clean water sanitation, one is affordable and clean energy, sustainable cities, and responsible consumption. I will show a few examples of how we are doing this. Across the, specifically I'll give some specific examples within India and probably 1 or 2 examples of China. So when we look at one example is, compressors is something that is used in every building or in every place where an air conditioning or refrigeration is done. And air conditioning and refrigeration is one of the big giants which affects climate change or energy consumption, especially in Indian cities. A city like Delhi sees something to the tune of 40% increase in its energy consumption when summers come in. So these are technologies which are available, which can use refrigerants which are not only low GWP and low ODP, but also high on energy efficiency. But we don't see an offtake of these technologies in India. Whereas when we look at examples, this is an example in China. In China, we are able to see this particular technology in a larger offtake. The overall sales of this technology in India is equivalent to my sales in China for 2 weeks. So that's the so in China they have kind of implemented directives or policies in a manner where they have clearly recognized whatever has happened in Beijing or Shanghai, and they would want to correct that. Whether we can replicate that within India, I don't think that's the model that will work, because everyone throws the frisbee in a different way. And so what we are trying to do here is to try and see what we can do here. And some examples in India is, the Cochin airport, which recently won the UN award as well. They have taken very positive steps. While they are not only a 100% renewable energy driven airport, they worked very closely with us, saying that we just don't want to produce more energy. We want to ensure that the energy is used in the most efficient way. And we worked very closely with them. They are using about 30% less energy than an airport of equal size. The question that comes back to us is, why is it done only in Cochin Airport? Why can't you do the same in other airports? The other airports may not be using renewable energy. Whichever energy they are using, they can still consume 30% less energy. So that's the direction that we are trying to see as to how. So from a technology point of view, these technologies are proven. How do you use these technologies across the spectrum? The other is PVR cinemas. Again, a large multiplex with about 100 plus theaters that are available. We worked very closely with them, and we are very happy with the way they took up the challenge of reducing energy, because it was a need for them, because in a lot of places they were not getting revenue just from ticket sales, and their energy consumption was very high, and it made a lot of business sense to do this. At the same time, the fact of the matter remains that while it is making improvements in their bottom line, because of a reduced energy consumption, they are able to serve the environment better. And they are actually using this as a USP to sell to their customers, that if you watch a movie in PVR cinemas, you are being more carbon friendly than watching it anywhere else. The other example is district cooling. And as Danfoss, we have been speaking about district cooling as a technology in India for the last 5 or 6 years. And we are yet to see a project that has gone live. But we are happy that there is some positive direction that is happening. And I am happy that Danfoss is continuing to believe that district cooling as a technology will take shape in India. Any other company would have probably said after 5-6 years, it is not moving, we will come back later. And we are working very closely with the Sustainable Energy for All, and Thane is the first place where we do foresee that the pilot project will take shape. Having said that, while we did a lot of calculations in convincing both the municipal authorities and the people who will buy, there is a new township that is coming around there with a lot of business houses, that in a special economic zone. With the district cooling, you can not only reduce your carbon footprint, but the cost of energy and cost of air conditioning that you will buy. It's a cultural change that you are trying to bring in, that air conditioning will be bought from an entity like you're buying electricity. So while people got convinced with the calculations that we did, as late as today afternoon, I was having a discussion with the United Nations representative here, and he said at the moment it looks a little bit challenging, because the electricity authority over there has suddenly decided that it is a special economic zone, that he will reduce the cost of electricity that he produce, whatever he had agreed to them, he has reduced it by further 50%. So from a business house perspective, he obviously looks at his returns. The question that comes back is, as policymakers, the policymakers should look at that while it is important to bring in investments and business houses into the township, can they look at, the same subsidy that is being given from an electricity point of view, can it be given to technologies such as district cooling, so that these technologies can take shape? And the last impact that I would talk about is food supply. And as we all know, doubling farmers' income is a big mandate for the government, and we believe it is very important. And what we also believe is, to double farmers' income, you need not produce more. You need to effectively connect what is being produced to the markets that is required. What it means is that you have to reduce food loss. And if we go into the details of the reports that are available on climate change, food loss in itself, when you take it as a country from a global angle, food loss in itself, the CO2 emissions that come from food loss is the third largest emitter of CO2. And it's a fact that by reducing food loss, you not only reduce the CO2 emissions, but you can directly increase the income of the farmer and give a better quality of food to the consumer. And we have proved this as Danfoss. We have worked for about 8 years with banana farmers in Tamil Nadu. And today those farmers are not only getting better income from a place where they were trying to sell their produce. Today they all live in two-storied houses, which are their own houses. They have cars with them. They are able to have forward contracts with the retail stores. So there is a lot of development that has happened. So we believe that by addressing the climate change, you can address a lot of other issues. And when you look at climate change from a business angle, you will get the results that you deserve, and the technologies that are currently available need to be deployed. And to do that, we believe business models become the key. And as energy efficiency is one of the key drivers which we believe along with renewables, and for renewables it is easy to get finance because renewables is something that the bankers can see, and it is easy to finance a renewable energy project, whereas energy efficiency is something which is invisible. And we have always found it challenging to get energy efficiency financing as to take off in India. And while it is a much, at least I think 10 times or something in China, we haven't seen that kind of energy efficiency financing happening in India, except for probably LED bulbs which EESL drove. And we believe if we can aggregate this demand of energy efficiency in clusters, and if we can finance these SMEs, small hotels, small buildings, we will see a lot more offtake of energy efficiency, and that will in a way help in culminating climate change as also reducing the energy demand in the country, and we will be able to give that energy more to the rural side. Thank you. With those words, I would like to...
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Krishna. So we'll come back to some questions that I have, and I guess the audience will have, and how do you make this characterization? I like that, characterization of climate change as a business opportunity, and I think that's the way to go. But how do you sort of scale it up? And one example that you gave of the EESL is indeed one of India's success stories, as I mentioned, but challenges, as you also mentioned, scaling that up. Our final speaker in this panel is Ulka Kelkar from the World Resources Institute, with whom ICRIER has had an engagement for the past several years. Thank you, Ulka.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kathuria, for the invitation to speak at this conference. It's been a very long day, and I'm surprised our audience hasn't dwindled more. But thank you very much for this opportunity. So just to kind of wake up people a little bit, if you're feeling tired, I like to present this as a quiz. I'm sure everybody knows where this picture is taken from, which part of the world. Sorry? You don't know? Dubai, yes, so somebody knows. This is a picture of islands that have been artificially created off the coast of Dubai. Some of them are in the shape of palm trees, some of them are in the shape of the continents of the world. So there is no limit to human ingenuity. We can do anything we set our minds to. This picture, anybody would like to guess what this looks like? Sorry? Some old place, some quaint European town. It's actually a suburb in China. It's called Thames Town. It was built as a city, a new settlement, as a suburb of Shanghai. And it was hoped that people would come in by the droves and buy up these houses and want to live in this lovely picturesque setting. But nobody ever came. It's a ghost town. So although there are no limits to our ingenuity, there can be sometimes limits to our vision and to our judgment. So that's really the backdrop against which I would like to just say a few remarks this evening. There is a historian by the name of Melvin Kranzberg who has some very intriguingly phrased laws of technology. And the first one says, technology is neither good nor bad, but neither is it neutral. Technology, in some sense, mirrors our intentions and it mirrors our foibles. From a greenhouse gas perspective, from a climate change perspective, the two sectors that are the most intractable, the hardest to mitigate, are also the two sectors which are the most booming sectors for the Indian economy. You have construction and transportation. And because Danfoss is here today, this has been a big week for climate change. There's been the IPCC report, there's been the Nobel announcement. There's also been a quieter announcement of something called the India Cooling Action Plan. This is a draft, it's open for consultation. You should all go and look at it on the website of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. But this cooling action plan basically is a plan for the increasing demand for air conditioning, refrigeration, and so on. And the bulk of the projected cooling demand is going to come from air conditioning from buildings and air conditioning from cars. And the plan acknowledges that as India grows, those who can afford ACs will buy their second and third air conditioner, while those who are the most exposed to extreme heat stress will not even be able to afford fans. At the same time, as we build our cities, as we cater to this growing demand, we are actually increasing the urban heat island effect by reducing the blue and green spaces, as they're called, building on low-lying lake beds and cutting down trees in order to widen roads and flyovers. So some figure that is often quoted in urbanization circles, which is that $90 trillion of infrastructure investment is going to take place. The question is, what are we going to build with that money? We also place a lot of hope in digital technologies. This particular picture is from a server, a data center of Google. We put a lot of emphasis on small things like switching off lights and fans. I'm staying in the Habitat Center here, and there's a reminder in the bathroom saying switch off lights. But you know that for every simple Google search that you do, it's like leaving on a light bulb for 17 seconds. And just to say nothing of the videos that we watch and the more extensive data analysis that we do. So today, data centers account for something like 2% of the world's electricity consumption. And the carbon emissions from these data centers are equivalent to those from aviation. So how will we fuel our digital needs as we go forward? So that was the pessimistic part of my presentation. Optimistically, if you see actual data, this is the GHG intensity of India's GDP. So even as we have grown, as our economy has grown, it's got decoupled from greenhouse gas emissions. So the Indian average, the GHG intensity of GDP started much higher than the world average, and the world includes Africa and everything. And it has come down and converged, and that's the sort of thing that the Danfoss is doing actually with energy efficiency, renewable energy. We're also shifting to services sector, which is less GHG intensive. So how is this happening, and what's the way forward? And I'm going to talk about 4 things. I'm going to talk about leapfrogging. I'm going to talk about circular economy. I'm going to talk about financial disclosure, and fourthly, carbon pricing. So about leapfrogging, this is a picture of a town called Ramnagara, where Sholay was shot. And this is on the highway between Bangalore and Mysore. And I was doing some field work over there. The goal of my project was to try to understand, from a behavioral economics lens, what motivates urban households in a small emerging city to adopt renewable energy. And if you see the picture, if you're afraid it's too bright, but on the lower level of the house, they have stacked up a bunch of coconut shell, coconut husks, because they have a boiler in their house for heating up water, and that is still using biomass. On the top floor of the same building, however, you have a solar water heater. So there is actually leapfrogging going on in a lot of our towns, straight from traditional biomass to modern renewable energy, without ever having gone to the route of fossil-based electric geysers. Today, 80% of our electricity, that is the world as a whole, 80% comes from fossil fuels. And the kind of scenarios that Purnamita talked about, if you want to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need 80% to come from renewables. The good part is that consistently for the last 6 years, the world has been adding more capacity each year in renewables than in fossil fuel technology. This has to be continued and really scaled up. And this makes sense in many ways. So the institute I work for, World Resources Institute, we did a study of thermal power plants in India. And we found that thermal power plants, as the power production in India has increased from 2011 to 2016 by 40%, the water consumption by these thermal power plants has also gone up by the same degree, because these plants have to be cooled. And 14 of 20 top utilities experienced at least one water shortage and revenue losses of $1 billion during this period. Instead, if these utilities were to actually meet the renewable energy, if India were to meet its renewable energy targets that it has already set, and these utilities were to meet the norms that have been notified, then we could cap water consumption at 2016 levels, even going forward to 2027. So it's not just energy, but also water stress that we can address as we go along. So that was leapfrogging. I'd now like to talk about circular economy. So you remember I talked to you about the data servers. So one way in which data servers, companies like Google try to reduce their energy consumption is by locating these data servers in Scandinavian countries, close to the Arctic Circle. And they actually use the icy seawater to cool these servers. What they're also doing in Stockholm, for example, is to use that excess heat for district heating. So this is one way of a circular economy where the waste from one activity feeds as an input into another activity. The most efficient cement company, like the one with the lowest carbon footprint in the world, is actually an Indian company. And they've achieved this through renewable energy, through energy efficiency, but also using the waste slag from steel plants and the fly ash from thermal plants. And they've done this while increasing their earnings by 70%. This particular picture is of a soda ash, is from Tuticorin. And what they have done is that they've captured the carbon from their power plant and converted it into soda ash. And this is the carbon capture, utilization, and storage that Purnamita was referring to. And this is crucially important because if you look at the IPCC 1.5 report, every scenario, optimistic, pessimistic, every scenario assumes that there will be carbon capture and storage, and not just capturing from power plants, but actually scrubbing it, extracting it from the air and storing it away. This can be done in two ways. One is a very simple way, which is to plant more trees. You get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But the other is a more complicated way, and this is, people are trying to do this through something called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage means you use biomass to produce energy, but then you capture the carbon emissions once the biomass is burnt and try to store it away in the earth or the ocean. And the IPCC scenarios really depend on this to a large extent, but we are competing for the same land with farms, with forests, with settlements, with cities, and solar farms as well, solar power with biodiversity. So there are trade-offs involved. There are two ways of addressing these trade-offs. One is technologically. So people are already talking about BECCS from agricultural waste, agricultural residue, or even from municipal solid waste. But finally, every time there are trade-offs, you have to discuss it with those people who are affected by those choices and give them a chance to deliberate upon these outcomes. The third point I want to talk about is financial disclosure. And this is a coal-based power plant that has been shut down. And increasingly, banks and shareholders of banks are getting concerned about the fact that what if climate change policies were actually to get implemented? What if Paris and UNFCCC actually becomes a success? Then what will happen to the money that we've invested in these thermal power plants? And I'd just like to read some data over here that if fossil fuel investments continue, but policies that are consistent with a 2 degrees Celsius future are actually implemented, and low-cost producers sell out their assets, renewable energy becomes more profitable than coal, then there will be stranded assets of fossil fuel investments of $12 trillion by 2035, and this could be just value that is lost off company balance sheets. So there is a movement towards financial disclosure in fossil fuel investments. There's something called a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. And as of this last month, 500 major companies and banks who are responsible for assets of $100 trillion have committed to this. And this kind of disclosure is mandatory in France and is being discussed in the EU, China, Canada, and so on. This is a quote from Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan. What is a cynic? A man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. But sometimes a zero price is also a price. It also signals something. So in our world right now, not putting a price on carbon is treating it as an externality. But at the same time, the way companies like Danfoss are moving forward, a lot of central governments, state governments, and companies are actually going ahead and putting a price on carbon one way or the other. They either have a carbon tax or the cap and trade kind of trading scheme, or they have an internal sort of notional shadow price within the company's balance sheets. And one sort of success story of carbon pricing is Sweden, which actually has the highest carbon tax of $150 per ton of CO2. This is very high. Usually companies look at something like $10 per ton of CO2. But emissions fell by 25% since Sweden implemented this tax, but the economy has grown at 5%. In British Columbia, they have actually recycled the revenues from this carbon tax and given it to low-income households who have been affected by this tax. So because this is a G20 conference, I thought I'd end by just mentioning the cross-border effect, the nature of climate change. So climate change cuts across borders in two ways. This is a picture of floods in Thailand in 2011. And one of the things that happened in these floods, that it was suddenly discovered that the world's production of hard disk drives was apparently concentrated in Thailand. And these factories shut down, and prices of these drives went up. And the PC makers had to absorb the costs, this cost increase. And it took almost a year for the price to come back to normal. It had almost doubled in the interim. So this is one way in which climate change impacts affect the real, affect economies, affect businesses. But also, it's important to know, I've been talking a lot about increasing renewables. But there is research which shows that as the penetration of renewable energy in the grid increases, there is a nonlinear increase in the cost of balancing that grid, because you have seasonal fluctuations in the sun and the wind, and you also have extreme events. So there's a nonlinear increase, and one way to balance these fluctuations is to have cross-border trade or a cross-border grid. So there is scope for agreement among countries. So I'd like to just end by mentioning, Dr. Kathuria talked about the work that ICRIER and WRI have been doing, and one of these is a flagship report that has just come out called the New Climate Economy Report. And it's basically has a global sort of macroeconomic model. It's called the E3ME model. And it sort of models many of the things that I've been talking about qualitatively, and it shows that if ambitious climate action is taken, it can lead to economic gains of $26 trillion by 2030 and 65 million new jobs. So it's actually quite a positive story over there. So just to end, I'd like to say that the IPCC report, in some sense, tells us that we have the scientific understanding, we have the technological capacity, and we have the financial means in order to tackle climate change. What we need to have is the political will to change a host of climate policies, a host of policies that are continuing to support the old, inefficient, and polluting economy and move to this new climate economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulka. On that positive note, can G20 become that forum to provide the positive movement on some of the actions that you were talking about? So maybe you can talk about this and the questions that I've raised, but we have about 20 minutes, give or take a few minutes, about 20 minutes to questions. So what I'll do is I'll take questions in batches of 3, if you don't mind, and then go back to the panelists. Please identify yourself, the same ground rules. Please be brief, do not make comments. Just ask questions to the panelists. Thank you.
I'm going to violate what Rajat just asked us to do. This is Amartya Lahiri. I thought it was a fantastic thing. I learned a lot. I have no idea why you're using the Frisbee example. It's terrible. I mean, in fact, everything you said would just completely, upset him, Sanjeev. I think Sanjeev's example is one of where you can't predict anything. You guys, what I heard was all science. Science is informing, there's science, there's data, the two are informing each other. That's what you're doing. And you're trying to see if there's, some way to make this operational and viable. His model is one of two table tennis players. None knows what the other guy is doing. Both guys are just reacting. And nobody knows, there's no point in learning how to play table tennis because there's nothing to be learned because you can't predict anything. That's just a terrible model. You should not use that example.
I resent the last statement that you make, and I'll tell you privately why I do that. Yes, you had a question? Yes. Yes, Anuradha, why don't you, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, this is a question for Krishna. It's basically, when you mentioned that the market for your products is higher in China, and one of the reasons you mentioned was directives and policies and laws which mandate the use. So is it the lack of legally enforceable mechanisms in India which mandate the use of climate-friendly technologies that is acting as an impediment for the business growth that you are talking about? And related to that, a question for perhaps Ulka or Purnamita. In a scenario where we're really in a scenario where global rules for climate change are now more of a bottom-up voluntary action. And India, to a large extent, I would imagine, has actually been reactionary, at least in the past, in terms of waiting for a mandate before actually implementing internal laws and policies. That has been slowly changing, but perhaps not fast enough. But going forward, one of the things that you mentioned, Ulka, for example, was the need for rethinking policies and laws to actually make them more carbon sensitive. So that's one part of it, certainly. But I think the other part, can that survive on its own, given the fact that clearly technologies are going to be expensive, and how is that going to work in the absence of an international framework that actually has financial mechanisms to actually ensure the realization of the overall, can a country act alone is really the question.